All right, good morning. We're back at it, and today we're going to talk about the third part of the Second World War in Europe, the Allied attacks in the South. Now, before we get into that, I need to touch on these wartime alliances, right? Remember, World War One military alliances were very important to the course of the war. They'll be important, of course, in World War II, and we have two sides here: the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and then the Allied powers. Which will grow in this year of 1941. First, with the Axis powers, we want to recognize that there's very little coordination between the Italians and the Germans, as each of them are pursuing their own foreign policy aims. This only begins to change as Italy starts to have a difficult time fighting the British in North Africa, in Egypt, which is going to lead Adolf Hitler to send support to the Italians in North Africa. With regard to the Allies, there's much better coordination amongst the Allied powers, especially the United States and Britain. Stalin, of course, is a member of this Grand Alliance as well, and he is going to start expressing some frustration at the slower opening of a Western front than he wants to see, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes here. But this alliance is strong, and throughout, the United States, for example, is supplying aid to both of their wartime allies. And now we already talked a bit about this American assistance that comes. We mentioned the destroyers for bases that came even before the United States got into the war. In March of 1941, the Lend-Lease Act, even before the United States officially got into the war. In August of 1941, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt met and outlined what the goals for a post-war world would be at what was called the Atlantic Charter. This was to give Franklin Roosevelt a rationale for the war as he attempted to gain support for American entry in the United States. But all of that is a moot point once we get to the attack at Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. The United States on the next day will issue a declaration of war, which is followed a few days later on December 11th, 1941, with a German declaration of war against the United States. Recall that Germany and Italy and Japan had a treaty agreement called the Tripartite Pact. And essentially, this was Germany standing behind that treaty agreement. But obviously, Hitler always wants something out of the deal. And he knew the United States was already financially supporting and materially supporting the Allies in Europe, but he'd also had some hope that Japan could offer some assistance against the Soviet Union in East Asia, and that maybe would ease pressure that the Germans were facing in their war against the Soviet Union after they've invaded. Immediately, Churchill and Roosevelt get down to putting together war plans. And in January of 1942, at the conclusion of the Washington Conference, the United States and Britain will agree to take a Europe first strategy in this fight. The focus would be on Nazi Germany. The rationale for the United States here is that they will need England as a staging point for an invasion of continental Europe. And so you can't lose England. You can't lose Europe. While Japan attacked the United States, and Japan is certainly a major threat in East Asia and will need to be dealt with, the most pressing concern for the defeat eventually of both Nazi Germany and the Japanese was to preserve England's sovereignty and defeat Nazi Germany in Europe. While Russia was fighting in the east, the United States and Britain would begin major operations in North Africa to support British armies in Egypt. And so recognize here that some of the first fighting in the war actually took place in North Africa as Italian armies struck against British forces in Egypt. But as the Italians weren't doing so well, Adolf Hitler is going to send one of his finest generals, a man named Erwin Rommel, to North Africa to lead what is known as the German Afrika Korps. And this new German force in North Africa starts to put even more pressure on the British in Egypt. This will lead to the first Allied invasion, British and American invasion in the Second World War, known as Operation Torch, where American soldiers and more British soldiers will land in North Africa in lands controlled at that time by the Vichy French regime. Please recall when Nazi Germany invaded France, Nazi Germany would occupy the northern portion of France, while the southern portion of France will become what is known as the Vichy regime, a French government essentially under the watchful eye of Nazi Germany. So it is French forces that are guarding these North African French colonies. Initially, they oppose Allied landings, but ultimately cease their resistance, which essentially means the end of the Vichy regime, and Germany will occupy all of France. In North Africa, then Erwin Rommel is pushing the British towards Alexandria, further towards the west, further towards that Suez Canal. But a defensive stand at a battle known as El Alamein in 1942 will drive Axis forces further west out of Egypt, across Libya, and eventually into Tunisia. The final battle in North Africa at Tunis will be in May of 1943, and Axis powers will be defeated there. Essentially, what the Axis is dealing with in North Africa is now fighting a two-front war. British and Americans are now in Egypt, and British and Americans in Western North Africa. The results of this North African campaign, the United States is firmly in the war effort now. We've got boots on the ground, and we're taking part in action. Vichy France comes to an end. North Africa is secure for the Allies. The Suez Canal can remain open. Next steps. Joseph Stalin is desperate for a second front to be opened in Europe. Remember that invasion of Nazi Germany, that Operation Barbarossa invasion into Soviet Union, was a 4 million man invasion of the Soviet Union, and Joseph Stalin is fighting that essentially by himself. And so he wants a second front opened in Europe that would ease that pressure. Winston Churchill is very nervous that an invasion from England into northern France might fail, just as the Germans couldn't do it. And in a democratic state, they might not get a second opportunity. And so Italy in South Europe was deemed as the safer option. Winston Churchill referred to Italy as the soft underbelly of Europe. And so this Italian invasion begins in July of 1943 with an amphibious invasion of the island of Sicily. These are joint operations between the United States and Britain, led by British General Bernard Montgomery and an American general named George Patton. By July of 1924, or pardon me, by July 24th of 1943, the fascist Grand Council in Rome will give Mussolini a vote of no confidence. They arrest him, and they begin to move to exit this war. By September, the Allies have moved from Sicily into the boot of Italy, and Italy will surrender, but the Allies will now be left with fighting Germans in Italy. Not long after, the Italians, without Mussolini, will switch sides and join the Allied forces. Ultimately, Rome will fall in June of 1944, but you can see how long this operation takes. That it is not giving Joseph Stalin the relief that he is looking for. So while the battles are taking place in Italy, the Allied powers are going to be planning for a larger invasion of France, and we'll talk about that next time. Take care.